The horse came out of the fog like a warning nobody had time to read. It tore down the village road at a speed that made two farmers drop their baskets and a baker's boy scream for his mother. On its back, hair loose and coat flying open, was a young woman riding as if the devil himself had lit a fire under the saddle. Behind her, a groomsman on a slower mount shouted her name over and over, but she did not slow down. She never did. Rosalind Winslow was the youngest daughter of Duke Alaric Winslow, and by the time she pulled her horse to a stop outside the old mill, half the village was already awake and talking. A woman selling eggs muttered to her neighbor that the girl would break her neck one day. An old man on a bench shook his head and said the Duke should have married her off 2 years ago. Neither of them said it quietly enough, and neither of them said it where Rosalind couldn't hear. She heard everything. She simply chose not to care. By the time she rode back through the front gates of Winslow Hall, the sun had fully risen, and her father was already standing on the stone steps, arms folded, his face carved from something colder than stone. "Do you have any idea," the Duke said, his voice low in the way that frightened everyone except her, "what time it is?" "I do," Rosalind said, swinging down from the horse before anyone could offer a hand. "It is morning, the best time to ride before the roads are full of people who think staring is a hobby. You were seen again. Dressed like a stable boy, again." "I was dressed like someone who did not want to fall off a horse, father. Would you have preferred I ride side saddle into a ditch, so the village could talk about my broken arm instead of my breeches?" A muscle moved in his jaw. Behind him in the doorway, her two older sisters watched with very different expressions. Serafina, composed as always, wore the quiet disapproval of someone who had long ago decided that dignity was worth more than freedom. Lily, gentler and softer, bit her lip and looked between her father and her sister as if hoping the storm would pass without lightning. It did not pass without lightning. It never did, not in this house. "This cannot continue," the Duke said. "You are 17 years past being a child, Rosalind, and yet you behave as though consequences are something that happen to other people. Perhaps because in this house they only ever happen to me." "That is not true." "Is it not?" She stepped closer, and for a moment father and daughter looked so alike, same sharp eyes, same refusal to back down, that even the servants pretending not to watch from the windows could see it. Serafina obeys, Lily pleases. And I am the one dragged into the parlor to be lectured every single week, as if I am the only child God gave you who has ever wanted something for herself. You are the only one who rides into the village before dawn dressed like a man. Someone in this family should be honest about what they want, instead of smiling and nodding and dying quietly inside. The words landed harder than she meant them to. She saw it in the way Lily flinched, the way Serafina's spine went even straighter, the way her father's face, for just a moment, lost its anger and showed something else underneath it, something tired, something almost afraid. Then it was gone, replaced again by the mask he wore every day since the Duchess had died. "Go to your room," he said quietly. "We will discuss this properly tonight." "There is nothing to discuss. You will talk and I will be told to listen, and nothing will change because nothing ever does." She walked past him without waiting for a response, past her sisters, up the wide staircase, and did not look back once. It was a talent she had perfected over 5 years, walking away before anyone could see that the words actually cost her something. Inside her room, she closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard, though not from the ride. Her mother's portrait hung above the fireplace, painted the year before she died, smiling in that soft, knowing way she always had. Rosalind stared at it the way she stared at it every single day, searching for some sign of what to do next, and finding only paint and silence as always. Downstairs, the Duke stood exactly where his daughter had left him, staring at the empty staircase. "She will be the end of me," he murmured, to no one in particular. "She takes after you, Your Grace," said Mrs. Pratt, the housekeeper, who had served the family since before any of the daughters were born and had therefore earned the right to say things no one else dared. "That is why it frightens you so much." He did not answer her. He did not need to. He walked into his study, closed the door, and sat behind a desk covered in letters he had been avoiding for weeks. Letters from suitors, from matchmaking aunts, from society mothers eager to see their sons married into a duke's family. He had ignored most of them because dealing with Rosalind's future felt like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. But something had to change. The whispers in the village were growing louder every week. His name, once spoken with respect, was now spoken with a strange kind of pity, the pity reserved for a man who could not control his own household. And control, more than anything else, was the one thing Duke Alaric Winslow had built his entire life around. Ever since the day his wife closed her eyes for the last time and left him alone with 3 daughters he did not know how to raise. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him and began to write, not a letter this time, but a list. 3 columns, 3 names at the top: Serafina, Lily, Rosalind. Beneath the first 2 names he wrote easily, almost gratefully, names of respectable young men from respectable families, men who would keep his daughters safe, comfortable, and quiet. Beneath the 3rd name, his pen hovered for a long moment before he finally wrote a single word. Unknown. He stared at it until the ink dried, then set the pen down and rubbed his eyes, feeling every one of his 48 years pressing down on his shoulders at once. Upstairs, Rosalind had already changed out of her riding clothes and was sitting by the window, watching the mist finally clear from the fields below. She thought about her mother, about the way the house had felt different before the illness took her, warmer somehow, softer at the edges. She thought about her sisters, about how easily they seemed to accept the shape of the life laid out for them, and how she had never once been able to make herself fit into any shape at all, no matter how hard she tried in the beginning. She was not trying anymore. Trying had only ever led to disappointment, mostly her father's, sometimes her own. A soft knock came at the door. Lily entered without waiting for permission, closing it gently behind her, and crossed the room to sit on the edge of the bed. "You should not provoke him like that," Lily said softly. "You know how he gets." "I know exactly how he gets," Rosalind said. "That is precisely why I do it. Someone has to remind him that we are people, not pieces on a board he gets to move wherever he pleases. He is only trying to protect us. He is trying to protect himself. There is a difference, Lily, even if you refuse to see it." Lily was quiet for a moment, twisting the edge of her sleeve between her fingers, a habit she had carried since childhood whenever she was working up the courage to say something difficult. "I worry about you," she finally said. "One day he will stop giving you chances. Then I will find my own. And if there are none to find—" Rosalind looked at her sister, really looked at her, and for the briefest moment the sharp edges softened. Lily was the only one in the house who ever came to check on her after these arguments, the only one who asked questions instead of offering judgment. "Then I will make some," Rosalind said. "I always do." Lily almost smiled at that, the ghost of something that might have been admiration crossing her face before worry took over again. She stood, smoothed her skirts, and walked toward the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. "Try to come down for supper tonight," she said. "Please, for me if not for him." Rosalind did not answer, but after Lily left, she sat for a long while thinking about the promise she had almost made and did not quite know how to keep. That evening, the dining room was unusually quiet. Serafina spoke politely about wedding preparations for a friend in the county. The Duke asked measured questions about the household accounts. Lily kept glancing toward the empty chair at the end of the table, the one Rosalind had not yet claimed. She arrived just as the soup was being cleared, hair now neatly braided, dress properly buttoned, every visible sign of the morning's rebellion carefully erased. She took her seat without a word, and for a while the meal continued in careful, fragile peace. It was the Duke who finally broke it. "I have been thinking," he said, setting down his fork with deliberate care, "that it is time we discuss the future more seriously, all 3 of you." Serafina straightened with interest. Lily's hands went still in her lap. Rosalind kept her eyes on her plate, already knowing where this was going. Serafina, Lord Ashford has expressed continued interest, and I believe an arrangement there would suit us both very well. Serafina inclined her head, pleased, though careful not to show too much emotion at the table, as she had been taught since childhood. Lily, the Duke continued, gentler now, there are several fine young men who have asked after you. We will discuss the matter properly when you are ready. Lily nodded, quiet and obedient as always, though something flickered briefly behind her eyes that no one at the table seemed to notice except Rosalind, who was watching more closely than anyone realized. Then the Duke's gaze moved down the table, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Rosalind, Father, we will need to discuss your future as well, properly. Soon. My future, Rosalind repeated, setting down her own fork with a precision that mirrored his own, is not something to be discussed like the household accounts. It is exactly like the household accounts, if left unmanaged for too long. The words hung in the air, sharp enough to cut. Serafina's eyes widened slightly. Lily reached for her water glass with a hand that was not quite steady, and Rosalind, for once, did not answer immediately. She simply looked at her father across the long table, across 5 years of grief neither of them had ever properly spoken about, across a lifetime of expectations she had never once agreed to. Then manage it, she finally said, standing so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Manage it the way you manage everything else. But do not expect me to sit quietly while you decide who I am supposed to become. She left the room without waiting to be excused, and this time no one called after her. The Duke sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the empty chair, while Serafina and Lily exchanged a careful, worried glance across the table. Outside in the hallway, Rosalind stopped by the window overlooking the front drive, breathing in slowly until the anger in her chest settled into something quieter, something more determined. Whatever her father was planning, whatever list he had written in that study of his, she was certain of one thing. She would not go quietly. She never had, and she was not about to start now. Behind her, unseen in the shadow of the staircase, the Duke stood watching his youngest daughter for a long moment before turning back toward his study, already thinking about the letters waiting on his desk, and the list with the single word beneath her name. Unknown. He intended to change that word very soon. He simply did not yet know how much it would cost him to try. 3 days after the argument at the dinner table, the Duke summoned all 3 daughters into his study, and Rosalind knew, the moment she saw the papers spread across his desk, that the peaceful silence of the last few days had only ever been the calm before something worse. I have made arrangements, he said, without any preamble, for each of you to meet several suitable gentlemen over the coming month. Serafina, you already know Lord Ashford will be joining us for dinner on Thursday. Lily, there are 2 young men from good families who have asked to call, and Rosalind. He paused, sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk toward her. She did not pick it up immediately. She simply looked at the neat handwriting, the careful list of names, titles, and estates, as though her future had been reduced to a ledger of assets and connections. There are 4 names here, the Duke said. Each one respectable, each one capable of managing a household with the kind of structure you seem determined to resist. I expect you to consider them seriously. And if I do not wish to marry any of them, then you will tell me why, with reasons I can respect, not simply because you have decided to dislike the idea of marriage altogether. Rosalind picked up the paper at last, scanned the names twice, and then, without a word of warning, walked to the fireplace and dropped it directly into the flames. The room went utterly silent. Serafina gasped audibly. Lily's hand flew to her mouth. The Duke rose so quickly from his chair that it nearly toppled backward. Rosalind Winslow, what in God's name? You asked for reasons, she said, watching the paper curl and blacken in the fire. Here is one. I would rather die a spinster in this very house than marry a man chosen for me like a horse at auction. That is quite enough. It is nowhere near enough, she said, turning to face him, and there was something different in her voice this time, something that had cracked open beneath the anger. "Do you know why I burned it, Father? Not because I am cruel, not because I enjoy defying you, though I know that is what everyone in this house believes. I burned it because every single name on that list belongs to a man who has never once spoken to me directly. They spoke to you about land, about dowries, about which of your daughters would make the most convenient wife. Not one of them has ever asked what I think, what I want, who I actually am. And you are asking me to simply accept that, because it would be easier for you if I did." The Duke's jaw tightened, but for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, he did not immediately respond with anger. He simply stood there, staring at his youngest daughter, searching for words that would not come. "You do not understand what it is to run a household," he finally said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier force. "To think of the future, of protection, of what happens to 3 young women alone in the world without proper arrangements made. Then teach me to run it, teach me to protect myself. Do not simply hand me over to the first man willing to sign a contract." Before the Duke could answer, there was a knock at the study door, and Mrs. Pratt stepped inside, looking uncharacteristically flustered. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption. Mr. Marsh has arrived, the new steward. He is waiting in the entrance hall." The Duke exhaled slowly, visibly grateful for the distraction, though everyone in the room understood that the conversation was far from finished. "Send him in," he said. "Girls, you are excused. We will continue this discussion later." Serafina left immediately, relieved to escape the tension. Lily lingered a moment longer, glancing at her sister with quiet concern before following. Rosalind, however, remained by the fireplace, arms crossed, watching as the study door opened and a stranger stepped inside. He was tall, with dark hair neatly combed, and an expression of quiet, careful discipline that seemed built into the very way he stood. He carried himself like a man used to order, used to being obeyed, used to solving problems through structure rather than emotion. His eyes moved briefly around the room, taking in the Duke, the scattered papers, the faint smell of burning parchment still lingering in the air, and finally landing on the young woman standing near the fire, who had clearly not been asked to leave, and clearly had no intention of doing so. "Your Grace," the man said, bowing respectfully, "Gideon Marsh. I believe you were expecting me." "Indeed," the Duke said, some of his usual composure returning. "Mr. Marsh comes highly recommended. He managed the Ashworth estate for 3 years before their family relocated abroad. I have hired him to oversee the daily operations of Winslow Hall, including the grounds, the tenant accounts, and the general discipline of the household staff." Gideon's eyes flicked briefly toward Rosalind again, curious but professional, before returning to the Duke. "I look forward to the work, Your Grace." "You will find it more challenging than you expect," Rosalind said, before her father could dismiss her from the room entirely. "This household does not respond well to discipline." "Rosalind, I am simply being helpful, Father. Mr. Marsh should know what he is walking into." Gideon studied her for a moment, and there was something in his expression that was not quite amusement, but close enough to it that Rosalind found herself unexpectedly irritated. "I appreciate the warning," he said evenly, "though I find that most things which resist discipline simply have not yet met the proper kind." The corner of the Duke's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile he had allowed himself in days. "Well said, Mr. Marsh. I believe you and I will get along quite well." Rosalind said nothing further, but as she left the study, she cast one last glance over her shoulder at the new steward, who was already unrolling a set of ledgers across the desk with the calm efficiency of a man who had never once, in his entire life, burned an important document out of pure defiance. She decided almost immediately that she did not like him. Over the following 2 weeks, Gideon Marsh proved himself exactly as capable as his reputation suggested. He reorganized the tenant accounts, streamlined the household schedules, and brought a level of quiet order to Winslow Hall that the staff had not experienced in years. Mrs. Pratt, who trusted almost no one on principle, found herself grudgingly impressed. Even Serafina, who rarely offered praise to anyone outside the family, admitted that the estate finally felt properly managed. Rosalind found the entire situation intolerable. It was not that Gideon was unkind. If anything, he treated her with the same careful, professional respect he extended to everyone else in the household, which somehow made it worse. He did not raise his voice when she deliberately rearranged the stable schedule to annoy him. He did not lose his composure when she released 3 geese into the newly organized garden shed simply to watch the resulting chaos. He simply corrected the problem, made a note in his ledger, and moved on, as though she were nothing more than a minor inconvenience to be managed alongside the tenant rents and the harvest accounts. "You cannot possibly find this satisfying," she said one afternoon, finding him in the stable yard, calmly recounting the horses after she had switched 2 of the nameplates on their stalls purely for her own entertainment. "Find what's satisfying, Miss Winslow? Being so infuriatingly calm about everything, it is unnatural." "I find it far more productive than the alternative," he said, not even looking up from his ledger. "Shouting rarely solves anything. It simply makes the shouter feel better for a moment." "And what would you know about it?" At that he did look up, and for the first time since his arrival, something flickered behind his composed exterior. Not anger, but something closer to old, careful pain, quickly hidden away again. "More than you might think," he said quietly. Then, before she could press further, he closed the ledger and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the stable yard, strangely unsatisfied by a victory she had not actually won. It became, without either of them quite intending it, a kind of ongoing contest. She tested his patience in every way she could invent, certain that eventually he would crack, would shout, would prove himself no different from every other man who had ever tried to manage her. He never did. Instead, he began anticipating her, quietly correcting her small rebellions before they could fully unfold. And worse, occasionally allowing them to happen simply because he seemed to understand, in some infuriating way, that she needed the small victories more than the household needed the order. One evening, after a particularly long day of arguments with her father over yet another suitor's letter, Rosalind found herself walking the grounds long after the household had gone to sleep, unable to settle the restless energy that always seemed to build inside her chest during these confrontations. She did not expect to find anyone else awake. Gideon was sitting on the low stone wall near the old orchard, a lantern beside him, a book open on his lap that he did not appear to actually be reading. "You should be asleep," she said, more out of surprise than actual concern. "I could say the same of you." She hesitated then, against her better judgment, sat down on the opposite end of the wall, keeping a careful distance between them. "My father wants me to marry a man I have never spoken to," she said, staring out at the dark shape of the orchard rather than at him. "Again, this time it is some baron's second son with a fondness for hunting and apparently very little else." "And you have no interest in hunting?" "I have no interest in being handed to a stranger like a piece of furniture." Gideon was quiet for a long moment, turning the unread book over in his hands. "For what it is worth," he finally said, "I do not think your father wants to hand you to anyone. I think he is afraid of losing control of something he has already lost control of a long time ago, and marriage feels, to him, like the only tool left in his hands." Rosalind turned to look at him properly for the first time that evening. "That is a remarkably generous reading of a man who tried to burn me a marriage contract this morning." "I did not say he was doing it well," Gideon said, and for the first time something like genuine warmth crept into his voice, something almost like a smile. "Only that fear rarely looks like fear from the outside. It usually looks like control." She studied him for a long moment, the careful lines of his face lit gently by the lantern, and felt something shift uncomfortably in her chest, something she did not yet have a name for and was not entirely certain she wanted to. "You are very strange, Mr. Marsh." "So I have been told, Miss Winslow." Neither of them moved to leave. The night stretched quietly around them, filled with the sound of wind through the orchard trees. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Rosalind sat still, genuinely still, without the restless urge to prove something, to fight something, to burn something down simply to feel less trapped. It would be some time before either of them understood exactly what had begun that night, sitting on a low stone wall in the dark. Two people who had both spent years building careful walls of their own, quietly, without either one fully noticing, beginning to take them down. The wedding preparations for Serafina began in earnest as autumn settled over Winslow Hall, and for a few short weeks, the household seemed almost peaceful. Tailors arrived with bolts of pale silk. Flowers were ordered from 3 counties away. Letters of congratulation piled up on the entrance table faster than Mrs. Pratt could sort them. Serafina herself grew quieter, more thoughtful, caught somewhere between excitement and the particular nervousness of a woman about to leave the only home she had ever known. Rosalind watched her sister's transformation with a strange mixture of tenderness and unease. She loved Serafina, in the careful, complicated way sisters often love each other after years of being compared, measured, and set against one another by well-meaning relatives. But watching her sister prepare so eagerly for a marriage built on suitability, rather than affection, made something tighten uncomfortably in Rosalind's chest. A fear she could not quite name, and did not particularly want to examine too closely. "You do not have to worry about me," Serafina said one evening, catching the look on her sister's face as the seamstress pinned the final hem of the wedding dress. "Julian is a good man, kind, patient. I have grown genuinely fond of him." "I know," Rosalind said, and she did know it truly. "I only wonder sometimes whether fondness is the same as happiness." "Not everyone needs the same kind of happiness, Rosalind. Some of us are content with steadiness. Not all of us need fire." The words were not unkind, but they landed somewhere tender all the same, and Rosalind said nothing more on the subject, though she thought about it long after the seamstress had gone and the candles had burned low. The wedding itself took place on a bright, crisp morning at the small stone chapel near the edge of the estate, filled with more guests than Winslow Hall had hosted in years. Nearly every notable family within 2 counties had been invited, eager for the chance to witness the Duke's eldest daughter married respectably, and equally eager, Rosalind suspected, for the chance to watch what the youngest daughter might do to embarrass the family in front of them all. She had promised herself, riding to the chapel that morning, that she would behave. For Serafina's sake, if nothing else. She had even worn the pale blue gown her father had chosen without complaint, had allowed her hair to be arranged properly, had smiled and curtsied, and said all the correct things to all the correct people throughout the ceremony and the wedding breakfast that followed. It was Lord Edmund Hale who finally broke her resolve. He found her near the edge of the garden, away from the main crowd, where she had slipped away for a few minutes of quiet before the dancing began. He was a portly young man with an inflated sense of his own charm, the 3rd son of an earl, and he had made no secret over the past month of his interest in courting her, an interest her father had not entirely discouraged. "Miss Winslow," he said, approaching with the confident stride of a man who had never once been told no and did not expect to hear it today either. "You look remarkably lovely, considering." "Considering what precisely, Lord Hale?" "Well," he chuckled, clearly finding himself very amusing. "Considering the stories one hears, horses at dawn, geese in the garden shed. I confess I came to your father's estate half expecting to find you climbing the drapery." "How disappointing for you, then, to find me merely standing on solid ground." "Not disappointing at all." He stepped closer, closer than was proper, close enough that she could smell the wine on his breath. "I rather admire spirit in a woman, provided it is properly managed, of course. A firm hand does wonders, I find." "Does it?" Rosalind said flatly, stepping back. "Indeed, my mother always said the wildest horses make the finest mounts, once broken properly." He reached out, catching her wrist with a familiarity she had given him no permission to take. "I should very much enjoy the challenge, Miss Winslow." The garden went very quiet in her ears. the distant sound of the wedding party fading into a low, dangerous hum. She pulled her wrist free with a sharp, deliberate motion. "Lord Hale," she said, her voice carrying clearly enough that two passing guests turned to look. "I am not a horse, and you are not nearly clever enough to manage one. If you touch me again, uninvited, I will make certain every guest at this wedding hears exactly what kind of gentleman you truly are, starting with your own mother." His face flushed a deep, furious red, humiliation replacing his earlier confidence in an instant. "You ungrateful." "Careful," she said, smiling now sweet and sharp all at once. "There are witnesses." He stormed away, muttering something under his breath that she did not bother to hear, and Rosalind stood alone in the garden for a moment, breathing hard, satisfaction and dread tangled together in equal measure. She knew, even before she turned around, that word of the confrontation would spread through the wedding guests within the hour, twisted and reshaped a dozen times before it reached her father's ears. It reached him faster than even she expected. By the time the dancing began, the Duke found her near the refreshment table, his expression tight with barely controlled frustration. "What happened with Lord Hale?" "He grabbed my wrist and compared me to a horse in need of breaking. I told him not to touch me again." "That is not what I heard." "Then what did you hear, father?" "I heard that you humiliated a peer's son in front of half the county, at your own sister's wedding, no less." Rosalind stared at him, something cold settling into her chest. "I did not embarrass myself, father. I defended myself." "There is a difference, even if the version reaching your ears has conveniently left that part out. Regardless of what happened, this is precisely the sort of behavior I warned you about. Do you understand what people will say now? About this family, about your prospects?" "I understand perfectly well what people will say. They will say exactly what they always say about me, no matter what I do. So forgive me if I would rather be talked about for defending myself than for allowing a man to treat me like livestock simply to protect a reputation that was never truly mine to protect in the first place." Around them, several guests had gone quiet, pretending not to listen while listening very closely indeed. The Duke seemed to notice the audience at the same moment Rosalind did, and something in his expression shifted, torn between the anger he clearly wanted to express and the awareness that continuing this argument in public would only make everything worse. "We will discuss this at home," he said finally, low and tight. "Of course we will," Rosalind said. "We always do." She walked away before he could respond, weaving through the crowd of dancers and well-dressed guests, past curious glances and half-whispered comments, until she found Lily near the edge of the garden, watching her with wide, worried eyes. "I heard," Lily said quietly. "Are you all right?" "I am fine." Lord Hale, however, will likely require several days to recover his dignity. Despite the tension still coiled tight in her chest, Rosalind found herself almost smiling at the memory of his furious, red face. Lily, after a moment's hesitation, smiled too, small and quick, before glancing around to make certain no one had noticed. "You should not provoke father like that," Lily said. "Not today of all days." "I did not provoke him, Lily. Lord Hale did. I simply refused to be quiet about it." "I know. I only meant—" Lily hesitated, twisting the fabric of her sleeve the way she always did when working towards something difficult. "I only meant that I wish, sometimes, that I had a fraction of your courage. To say the things I actually feel, instead of simply nodding along." Rosalind studied her sister carefully, catching something beneath the words that had not been there before, some new weight Lily seemed to be carrying. "Is there something you wish to say, Lily?" Lily's eyes darted toward the crowd, toward their father still standing near the refreshment table, and then back to her sister. "Not here," she said quietly. "Not today, but soon, I promise." Before Rosalind could press further, Serafina appeared beside them in her wedding dress, glowing and radiant despite the earlier tension, pulling both her sisters into an unexpected embrace. "Thank you," she whispered, "for coming today, for being here. Whatever happened with Lord Hale, I do not care." I am simply glad my sisters were both here to see this." For a moment, standing together in the garden, the three sisters set aside every argument, every difference, every careful comparison the world had drawn between them, and simply held onto one another, the way they had when they were small children, before grief and expectation had slowly carved separate paths for each of them to walk. The dancing continued long into the evening, and though the Duke watched his youngest daughter carefully for the remainder of the celebration, he said nothing further, allowing the fragile peace of the day to hold, at least until the carriages had carried the last guests away and the house had finally gone quiet. It did not hold for long. Later that night, long after the household had retired, Rosalind found herself once again walking the grounds, the events of the day replaying restlessly in her mind. She was not entirely surprised to find Gideon in his usual place near the orchard wall, though tonight he did not have his lantern lit, sitting instead in the pale silver light of the moon. "I heard about Lord Hale," he said, before she had even fully approached. "I imagine the entire county has heard about Lord Hale by now. For what it is worth, I think you were right to speak as you did." She stopped, surprised, studying him in the dim light. Most people seemed to think otherwise. Most people were not standing close enough to hear what he said to you. I was. Something hardened briefly in his expression, quickly controlled. "If I had been closer, Miss Winslow, I confess I might have said something considerably less polite to him myself." The admission startled her, warmth spreading unexpectedly through her chest at the quiet protectiveness in his voice, carefully restrained though it was. "You saw. I was arranging the carriages near the garden path. I saw enough." He paused, choosing his next words with obvious care. "You should not have to defend yourself alone at every turn, Rosalind." It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal address attached to it, and the sound of it in his voice did something strange and unsettling to the careful walls she had spent years building around herself. "I have grown rather used to it," she said quietly. "That does not mean it is right." They stood together in the quiet dark for a long moment, the events of the day settling slowly around them, and Rosalind found herself, not for the first time, wondering exactly when the infuriating new steward had stopped feeling like an obstacle and started feeling like something else entirely. Something she was not yet ready to name, but could no longer quite ignore. Lily's secret unraveled on a rainy afternoon in early winter, though Rosalind would later realize the signs had been there for weeks, quietly hidden beneath her sister's usual gentle smiles and careful obedience. It began with a missing basket of bread and cheese from the kitchen, which Mrs. Pratt noticed and mentioned in passing, assuming one of the younger servants had taken it without permission. It continued with Lily's increasingly frequent walks to the village, always alone, always returning with color high in her cheeks and a lightness in her step that had not been there before. Rosalind noticed. Rosalind always noticed things other people missed, particularly when it came to the people she loved. She finally confronted her sister on a wet, gray afternoon, catching her just as she returned from another walk, her cloak soaked through and her boots caked with mud from the village road. "Where have you been?" Lily startled, nearly dropping the empty basket she carried. "Walking. You know I enjoy walking." "In the rain, for the third time this week." "Rosalind, please." "Who is he?" Lily's face went pale, then flushed deeply red, confirming everything Rosalind had suspected before a single word of explanation had been offered. "Come inside," Rosalind said gently, taking her sister's arm. "Before someone else sees you standing in the rain looking like you have just been caught doing something you should not have been doing." Once safely in Rosalind's room, door closed, fire crackling low in the grate, Lily finally allowed the careful composure she wore for the rest of the household to crumble entirely. "His name is Owen Blake," she said, twisting her damp gloves between shaking hands. "He runs the printing shop in the village, the one near the old bridge. I met him nearly 2 months ago, when I went to order the invitations for Seraphina's wedding." "A printer," Rosalind said carefully. "I know how it sounds." "I did not say anything." You did not have to, I can hear it in your voice. Lily's eyes filled with tears, frustration and fear tangled together. He is kind, Rosalind. Genuinely kind in a way I have never once experienced from any of the gentlemen father has paraded in front of me. He listens when I speak. He asks what I think, what I want, not simply what I am willing to agree to. I have never felt more like myself than I do when I am with him. Rosalind sat down beside her sister, taking her cold, trembling hands into her own. Does he know who you are, truly? Yes, from the very beginning. It changed nothing for him. Lily laughed softly, though it came out closer to a sob. That is precisely the problem, is it not? It should change everything. Father would never allow it. A duke's daughter and a village printer. It is impossible. Nothing is impossible, Rosalind said quietly, though even she was not entirely certain she believed it. Difficult perhaps, but not impossible. Lily looked at her sister with something between hope and disbelief. You would help me. After everything Father has said about propriety, about reputation, about how one scandal in this family could unravel everything he has spent years building. Lily, Rosalind squeezed her sister's hands firmly. I have spent my entire life being told what I am allowed to want. I will not stand by and watch the same thing happen to you, not when I can see, clear as anything, how happy this man makes you. Whatever help you need, you shall have it. I promise you that. For the first time in longer than Rosalind could remember, Lily threw her arms around her sister and wept, not from sadness this time, but from the sheer relief of finally being seen, finally being understood, finally not carrying the weight of her secret entirely alone. Over the following weeks, Rosalind became her sister's most careful and devoted protector. She covered for Lily's absences, invented convincing excuses for the household staff, and even accompanied her sister to the village on several occasions, standing watch near the printing shop while Lily and Owen stole precious, stolen moments together, always careful, always cautious, always aware of exactly how much they stood to lose if discovered. It was, in many ways, the first time Rosalind had ever truly understood what it meant to love someone enough to risk her own comfort for their happiness, and the experience softened something in her that had been hardened by years of fighting battles entirely alone. She met Owen Blake properly on a cold afternoon in late November, when Lily finally worked up the courage to introduce them at the small printing shop near the bridge. He was not what Rosalind had expected. Not particularly handsome in the conventional sense, nor wealthy, nor connected to any family of note, but there was a warmth in his eyes when he looked at Lily, a genuine, unguarded affection that no amount of wealth or title could manufacture. Your sister speaks of you often, he said, shaking Rosalind's hand with a firm, honest grip. She says you are the bravest person she has ever known. She exaggerates. I do not think she does. He glanced toward Lily, something soft and unmistakable passing between them. I know what we are asking of her, allowing this to continue. I know the risk it places on your family's name. If there were any other way, believe me, I would find it. But I cannot make myself stop loving her, Miss Winslow, no matter how impossible the circumstances may be. Rosalind studied him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his voice against everything she knew about the world her family occupied. A world built on careful arrangements and respectable connections. A world with very little room for a duke's daughter and a village printer. Then we shall simply have to find a way to make the impossible slightly less impossible, she said finally. Won't we? It was a promise easier made than kept. The trouble began when Seraphina, now settled into married life at Ashford Manor, returned for a brief visit and noticed, within a single afternoon, the same subtle changes in Lily that Rosalind had spotted weeks earlier. Unlike Rosalind, however, Seraphina's first instinct was not protection, but concern for the family's reputation, carefully cultivated over years and now, in her eyes, dangerously at risk. Something is different about her, Seraphina said quietly to Rosalind, catching her alone in the hallway after supper. I do not know what it is precisely, but I know our sister well enough to recognize when she is hiding something. Perhaps she is simply happy, Rosalind said carefully. Happy about what exactly? She has no suitor father has approved, no engagement pending. What could possibly account for that particular kind of happiness? Rosalind said nothing, and her silence, she realized too late, said more than any words could have. Rosalind, Seraphina's voice sharpened, worry replacing curiosity. What have you done? I have done nothing but support my sister in something that makes her genuinely happy for the first time in her life. Oh, Rosalind. Seraphina pressed her fingers to her temples, exhaling slowly. Please tell me this does not involve a man father would never approve of. The silence that followed answered the question more clearly than any confession could have. You must stop this, Seraphina said, urgency creeping into her voice. Immediately. If father discovers what has been happening and worse, discovers that you have been actively helping conceal it, the consequences will fall on all three of us. My marriage to Julian was arranged carefully, built on the reputation of this family. Do you understand what a scandal like this could do to that, to everything we have all worked to build? I understand that you are more concerned with reputation than with our sister's happiness. That is unfair. Is it? Rosalind's temper flared, old frustrations rising quickly to the surface. You married a man you barely knew because it was suitable, and now you expect Lily to do the same, simply because it is easier, safer, more convenient for everyone except her. I love Julian, Seraphina said, quiet but firm. That was not simply a matter of convenience, whatever you may believe. Perhaps not. But you cannot deny that convenience made falling in love a great deal easier for you than it will ever be for Lily. Loving a man father would never in 100 years approve of. Seraphina fell silent, some of the certainty draining from her expression, replaced by something more complicated, something closer to genuine worry rather than simple disapproval. I am not trying to hurt her, she finally said. I am trying to protect her in the only way I know how. Please, Rosalind, at least consider what will happen if father discovers this on his own, rather than hearing it from one of us. It was, Rosalind realized with a slow, sinking feeling, a fair point, and one she had been deliberately avoiding for weeks. Sooner or later, secrets in a house as carefully watched as Winslow Hall had a way of finding the light, whether anyone intended them to or not. She did not have long to wait to discover exactly how that particular truth would unfold. The discovery came, as these things so often do, at the worst possible moment. A neighboring landowner, Mr. Caldwell, had traveled into the village on business and happened to see Lily and Owen together near the printing shop, standing far closer than propriety allowed, laughing over something private between them. Mr. Caldwell, unfortunately, was well acquainted with the Duke, and even more unfortunately, was not a man known for keeping observations to himself. The letter arrived at Winslow Hall 2 days later, delivered directly into the Duke's hands, and the household knew within the hour that something had gone terribly wrong. Rosalind heard the shouting from her father's study before she even reached the top of the staircase. Lily's name spoken with a fury she had never once heard directed at her gentle, obedient sister. By the time Rosalind reached the study, Lily was already standing before their father's desk, pale and trembling, tears streaming silently down her face while the Duke paced back and forth, the offending letter crumpled in his fist. A printer, he was saying, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger. My daughter, secretly meeting a common tradesman in the village, for weeks, apparently, while I sat here believing every one of you understood the meaning of family honor. Father, please let me explain. There is nothing to explain. Mr. Caldwell saw you with his own eyes, laughing, standing far too close, in public where anyone might have seen. His name is Owen, Lily said, and something in her voice, small but firm, made both her father and her sister turn to look at her more closely. He is kind and honest, and he has never once made me feel like a burden or an obligation to be managed. I love him. The word landed in the room like a struck match. You will not see him again, the Duke said, his voice deadly quiet now, more frightening than his earlier shouting had been. Effective immediately, I forbid it entirely. Father, I said it is forbidden, Lily. This conversation is finished. It was at that moment that Rosalind stepped fully into the room, unable to remain silent a moment longer. This is my fault, she said. Not Lily's. I encouraged it. I helped arrange the meetings. If you wish to be furious with someone, Father, be furious with me. The Duke turned toward her, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, his anger seemed almost overwhelmed by sheer, exhausted disbelief. Of course, he said, laughing bitterly without any real humor in it at all. Of course this traces back to you. I should have known the moment I heard the word scandal that your hand would be somewhere in the middle of it. I only wanted her to be happy. Happiness is not the only consideration in this family, Rosalind. Do you understand nothing? A duke's daughter cannot simply marry a village printer because it makes her happy. There are responsibilities, obligations, an entire family's reputation resting on decisions like these, decisions that ripple outward far beyond the two people involved. Then perhaps the family's reputation is worth less than my sister's heart, Rosalind said, stepping closer, refusing to back down even as her father's face darkened further. You speak endlessly of obligation and reputation, Father, but what of love? What of happiness? Did any of that matter when you married Mother? Or was that simply another arrangement dressed up in prettier language? The room went utterly silent. The mention of her mother, so sudden and unexpected, seemed to knock something loose in the Duke, some carefully guarded wall he had spent 5 years reinforcing. For a long moment, he simply stared at his youngest daughter, something raw and unguarded flickering across his face before he mastered himself once more. Do not, he said, his voice low and dangerous, speak of your mother in this context. Why not? Because it is inconvenient. Because remembering that you once married for love, real love, makes it that much harder to justify forcing the same choice away from your own daughter. That is enough, Rosalind. It is nowhere near enough, not until you actually hear what we are trying to tell you. The Duke's hands trembled slightly at his sides, and for a moment Rosalind thought he might finally break entirely, finally say something honest instead of something dictated by duty and fear. Instead, he simply turned away, walking to the window, his back rigid, his voice, when it finally came, quieter than either daughter expected. Leave me, he said, both of you. I need to think. Lily, still crying softly, allowed Rosalind to lead her from the study, but the moment the door closed behind them, she turned to her sister with wide, frightened eyes. What have I done? She whispered. What have we done? We have told the truth, Rosalind said, though even she was not entirely certain, standing in the hallway with her sister trembling beside her, exactly what price that truth was about to cost either of them. The following days passed in a strange, heavy silence throughout Winslow Hall. The Duke spoke to almost no one, retreating into his study for hours at a time, emerging only for meals eaten in tense, careful quiet. Lily was confined to the house entirely, forbidden from visiting the village under any circumstances, and though she obeyed the restriction outwardly, Rosalind could see the way her sister's spirit dimmed a little more with each passing day, like a candle slowly starved of air. It was Gideon who finally broke through the household's oppressive tension, though not in any way Rosalind might have predicted. She found him in the study one evening, several days into the standoff, standing before the Duke's desk with a stack of ledgers in his hands, though the conversation happening between the two men had clearly moved far beyond household accounts. Forgive my presumption, Your Grace, Gideon was saying as Rosalind quietly approached the door, drawn by the unfamiliar sound of her father's steward speaking with such careful firmness. But I have managed households for many years, and I have seen the particular damage that comes not from scandal itself, but from how a family chooses to respond to it. This is not your concern, Marsh. Perhaps not, but I have watched Lady Lily these past days, Your Grace, and I confess I am concerned for her well-being, quite apart from any question of reputation. The Duke turned from the window, studying his steward with an expression Rosalind could not quite read from the doorway. You believe I am wrong to forbid this attachment. I believe, Gideon said carefully, that forbidding something rarely extinguishes it. It simply drives it into shadow, where it becomes far more difficult to manage, and far more dangerous when it finally comes to light again, as these things nearly always do. He paused. I grew up watching my own father forbid a great many things he did not understand, Your Grace. I watched what that cost our family in the end. I would not wish the same outcome upon yours, if I may speak so plainly. Something in his voice, quiet but weighted with old, personal grief, seemed to catch the Duke's attention in a way that mere argument never could have. What do you suggest instead, then? Meet him, Gideon said simply, the printer. Before deciding anything further, if he proves unworthy of your daughter's affection, you will see it plainly enough, and she will trust your judgment far more readily than if the decision is simply forced upon her without explanation. And if he proves otherwise— He paused again. Well, perhaps it is worth considering that respectability and worthiness are not always the very same thing, Your Grace. The Duke said nothing for a long moment, staring at his steward with an expression somewhere between irritation and grudging consideration. Rosalind, still standing unseen in the doorway, felt something warm and unexpected bloom in her chest, watching this quiet, careful man argue on her sister's behalf with more conviction than she had managed in days of shouting. You overstep, Marsh, the Duke finally said, though there was no real heat behind the words. Undoubtedly, Your Grace, it would not be the first time. A long silence stretched between them, and then, to Rosalind's genuine astonishment, her father exhaled slowly and rubbed a tired hand across his face. Arrange it, he said quietly. Have the printer come to the house, properly through the front door, not sneaking through village alleyways like some criminal. If I am to judge the man, I will judge him honestly, not through the distorted lens of Mr. Caldwell's gossip. Yes, Your Grace. As Gideon turned to leave the study, he caught sight of Rosalind standing in the doorway, and something passed between them. Quiet and unspoken, gratitude on her part, quiet reassurance on his. She said nothing as he passed, but her hand brushed his briefly, deliberately, and the warmth of that small, simple contact stayed with her long after he had disappeared down the hallway. For the first time in days, Rosalind allowed herself to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, her father was capable of change after all. Owen Blake arrived at Winslow Hall 3 days later, dressed in his best coat, hands visibly trembling as he was announced properly at the front door for the very first time. Lily waited in the drawing room beside Rosalind, gripping her sister's hand so tightly it nearly hurt, while the Duke sat in his usual chair near the fireplace, his expression carefully unreadable. The meeting began stiffly, formal and cautious on both sides. The Duke asked pointed questions about Owen's business, his family, his prospects, his intentions, and Owen answered each one honestly, without exaggeration or false humility, admitting plainly that he had little to offer in terms of wealth or title, but a great deal to offer in terms of steady devotion and genuine respect. I understand what I am asking, Your Grace, Owen said finally, his voice steady despite his obvious nerves. I understand that a printer courting a duke's daughter defies every expectation society has built around such matters. I cannot offer her a grand estate or a noble title, but I can offer her honesty and kindness and a partnership built on genuine equality rather than obligation. I love your daughter, sir. Not the idea of what marrying her might gain me, but her, precisely as she is. The Duke studied him for a long, silent moment, and Rosalind held her breath, watching her father's face for any sign of what he might be thinking. You are aware, the Duke finally said, that society will not be kind to either of you should this arrangement proceed. I am aware, Your Grace. There will be talk, judgment. Doors that once might have opened for my daughter will remain firmly closed. I am aware of that as well. Owen glanced at Lily, something soft and unwavering in his expression. I would rather face a lifetime of closed doors alongside her, Your Grace, than a lifetime of open ones without her. Something shifted in the Duke's expression at that, some old memory surfacing briefly behind his eyes before he carefully smoothed it away again. Rosalind, watching closely, wondered if he was thinking of her mother, of whatever choices and sacrifices had once shaped his own marriage, choices none of his daughters had ever been told about in any real detail. "I will need time to consider this properly," the Duke finally said. "This is not a decision I intend to rush, regardless of what any of you might wish." It was not the outright approval Lily had hoped for, but it was, unmistakably, far more than an outright refusal, and when Owen finally left the house that evening, Lily embraced her father with tears in her eyes, thanking him simply for listening, for giving them a chance rather than closing the door entirely. The Duke said nothing in response, merely patted his daughter's shoulder awkwardly, clearly unused to such open displays of emotion. But Rosalind noticed, watching from across the room, that he did not pull away from the embrace either. It was, perhaps, the beginning of something changing within him, though the true test of that change was still to come. The rumors, unfortunately, had already begun spreading through the county, carried by Mr. Caldwell's loose tongue and amplified by every eager gossip within riding distance. Within a fortnight, the story of the Duke's youngest daughters, one caught in scandal with an unsuitable tradesman, the other infamous for public confrontations with respectable suitors, had reached every drawing room and dinner party from Winslow Hall to the county seat. The Duke felt the weight of it everywhere he went. Old friends grew subtly cooler in their correspondence. Invitations that had once arrived regularly began arriving less frequently, and always with a certain careful distance attached to them. At a gathering hosted by a long-time family acquaintance, the Duke overheard, quite by accident, two matrons discussing his household in low, pitying tones, wondering aloud whether the man had simply lost all control of his daughters entirely, whether grief had softened him past the point of proper governance. He returned home that evening in a foul, brittle mood, and it was Rosalind, predictably, who bore the brunt of it. "This cannot continue," he said, finding her in the library later that night, his voice tight with barely restrained frustration. "The whispers grow louder by the day, and I am tired, Rosalind, genuinely tired, of defending decisions I am not even certain I have made correctly. Then perhaps stop trying to defend them to people who were never going to understand regardless. It is not so simple, and you know it." He rubbed his temples, looking suddenly older than his years, more exhausted than she had ever seen him. "I have a responsibility to this family's name, to your futures, to everything your mother and I built together before she died. Every scandal, every whisper, chips away at that foundation a little more." "Or perhaps," Rosalind said quietly, setting down the book she had been pretending to read, "the foundation was never as solid as you believed it to be, if it can be shaken so easily by whispers from people who barely know us at all." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost most of its earlier heat, replaced by something wearier, more honest. "I have considered," he said slowly, "sending you to your Aunt Cordelia's estate in the north, for a time. Until the talk dies down, and until you have had proper opportunity to reflect on your conduct, away from whatever influence has made you so determined to defy every reasonable expectation placed upon you." Rosalind went very still. "You would send me away." "It would only be temporary." "Would it? Or is this simply the quiet, respectable version of locking me away, until I have been properly broken into something more convenient?" "That is not fair." "Is it not?" She stood, her voice shaking now, genuine fear breaking through her usual sharp composure. "Aunt Cordelia is famous throughout the county for exactly one thing, father, and it is not kindness. You would send me to a woman who once forced her own daughter into a marriage, so miserable the poor girl barely speaks anymore, simply because it would be easier for you than continuing to face whatever whispers reach your ears at dinner parties. I am trying to protect this family." "You are trying to protect yourself from discomfort, and dressing it up as protection for the rest of us." Tears burned unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, and she hated herself a little for it, hated how much his words had actually managed to hurt her, despite years of building careful walls specifically to prevent exactly this kind of vulnerability. "Do you know what it is like, father, to spend 5 years watching you retreat further and further behind rules and expectations, further and further away from the man who used to laugh with mother in this very room. I'm not trying to destroy this family's reputation. I'm trying to remind you that we are still a family at all, not simply a collection of names to be managed and married off according to whatever version of respectability lets you sleep at night." The words hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded in a way neither of them had allowed in years. The Duke stared at his daughter, something breaking visibly across his composed expression, old grief finally surfacing after 5 long years of careful suppression. "I do not know how to do this without her," he finally said, so quietly Rosalind almost missed it entirely. "Your mother always understood how to reach each of you, how to guide without controlling, how to love without fear ruining every decision. I have spent 5 years terrified of failing all 3 of you, and somewhere along the way that fear simply became the only language I knew how to speak." Rosalind felt her own anger dissolve slowly into something softer, something that ached in an entirely different way. "Then learn a new language, Father," she said gently, "before it is too late to reach any of us at all." The Duke did not answer immediately, but for the first time in longer than Rosalind could remember, he reached out and took her hand, holding it the way he used to when she was very small, before grief had built its careful, terrible walls between them. "I will think on what you have said," he finally told her, "truly think on it this time." It was not an apology. It was not even a promise. But it was, Rosalind realized, walking slowly back to her room that night, the most honest conversation she and her father had shared in 5 long years, and for the first time she allowed herself to hope that perhaps something between them might actually be capable of healing, given enough time and enough courage from both sides. She did not yet know how quickly that hope would be tested, nor how close her father would come to sending her away regardless before finally, truly, deciding otherwise. The letter from Aunt Cordelia arrived faster than anyone expected, a brisk, businesslike response to an inquiry the Duke had apparently sent weeks earlier, before the conversation in the library, before the honesty that had passed between him and his youngest daughter. It sat on his desk for 3 full days before he finally called Rosalind into his study to discuss it, and the moment she saw the familiar seal on the folded paper, her stomach dropped with cold, sinking certainty. "You already decided," she said quietly before he could speak, "before we spoke in the library. You had already written to her." "I wrote the letter before that conversation, yes." The Duke set the paper down carefully, meeting his daughter's eyes with an expression she could not quite read. "But I have not yet decided what to do with her response." Rosalind said nothing, waiting, every muscle in her body coiled tight with the effort of remaining still. "Your aunt has agreed to take you in for the season," the Duke continued slowly. "She believes, and I quote, that a firm hand and proper structure would do wonders for a young woman with your particular temperament." "And what do you believe, Father?" The question hung between them, heavier than either of them had expected it to be. The Duke rose from his desk and walked to the window, staring out at the gray winter grounds for a long moment before answering. "I believe," he said finally, "that I have spent 5 years mistaking control for care and structure for love, because it was easier than admitting how frightened I have been since your mother died. I believe that sending you to Cordelia would solve nothing, except perhaps my own discomfort at watching you make choices I do not fully understand." He turned back to face her. "And I believe, though it has taken me far too long to admit it, that you are not broken, Rosalind, and were never in need of fixing in the first place. You are simply your own person, in a family that has spent far too long expecting you to be someone else entirely." Rosalind stood frozen for a long moment, uncertain whether she had truly heard the words correctly, or whether exhaustion and hope had somehow conspired to invent them. "You are not sending me away." "No," the Duke shook his head slowly. "I am not sending you away. I only wish I had understood this sooner, before 5 years of silence and structure drove such distance between us." Tears rose unexpectedly in Rosalind's eyes, and for the first time since her mother's death, she crossed the room and embraced her father without hesitation, without the careful armor she had built specifically to protect herself from moments exactly like this one. The Duke, startled but unresisting, held his daughter tightly, and for a long, quiet moment, 5 years of grief and misunderstanding finally began, slowly and imperfectly, to heal. "There is something else," Rosalind said eventually, pulling back slightly, gathering her courage for the second, harder conversation she had been avoiding for weeks. "Something I have not yet told you." "Rosalind." "Gideon," she said simply. "Mr. Marsh. I care for him, father, deeply, more deeply than I have ever cared for anyone outside this family." The Duke's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something more complicated, though not, Rosalind noted carefully, outright anger. "He is my steward. I am aware. He has no title, no significant fortune of his own. I am aware of that as well." Rosalind lifted her chin, old defiance returning, though gentler now, tempered by everything that had just passed between them. "I have watched you learn these past weeks that respectability and worthiness are not always the same thing, father. I am asking you to extend that same understanding to me." The Duke studied his daughter for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, something that might almost have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "He argued rather passionately on Lily's behalf," he admitted slowly. "More passionately than most men in his position would dare, speaking to a duke about matters that were, technically, none of his concern. He cares deeply for the people in this household, father. All of them, myself included. So I am beginning to understand." The Duke exhaled slowly, some final resistance visibly draining out of him. "I will not pretend this does not present certain difficulties, Rosalind. Society will talk, regardless of what I decide. But I find, after everything these past weeks have taught me, that I am considerably less interested in what society thinks than I once believed myself to be." It was not, Rosalind understood, a full blessing, not yet. But it was, unmistakably, an opening, a door left deliberately unlocked rather than firmly closed, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included both her family's acceptance and her own genuine happiness, rather than forcing herself to choose permanently between the two. She found Gideon later that evening in the stable yard, going through his usual routine with the same quiet, careful discipline she had once found so infuriating, and now found, somehow, deeply comforting. "I spoke with my father," she said, approaching slowly, "about us." Gideon went very still, setting down the lantern he had been carrying. "And he did not forbid it," she smiled, something warm and unguarded breaking through her usual sharp composure. "He did not exactly bless it either, not fully, not yet. But he did not forbid it, Gideon, and knowing my father, that is very nearly a miracle." Something shifted across Gideon's careful expression, relief and hope, and something deeper, something he had clearly been guarding just as carefully as she had guarded her own feelings these past weeks. "I have cared for you," he said quietly, closing the distance between them. "Since the very first evening you sat beside me on that orchard wall, refusing to explain why you were awake so late, refusing to admit you were troubled by anything at all, even as it was written plainly across your entire face. You never said anything. I'm a steward, Rosalind. You are a duke's daughter. I did not believe, for a long while, that saying anything would change the fundamental impossibility of the situation. And now, he said, reaching for her hand with a gentleness that made her breath catch unexpectedly, I find myself considerably more hopeful than impossibility generally allows." She laughed softly, the sound carrying warm and genuine through the cold evening air, and when he finally leaned down to kiss her, carefully, questioningly, giving her every opportunity to step away if she wished, she did not step away at all. She simply closed the remaining distance herself, answering a question that had been quietly building between them for weeks, in a stable yard filled with the smell of hay and horses and the last golden light of the setting winter sun. It was not, either of them understood, going to be simple. There would be more difficult conversations ahead, more careful navigation of society's expectations, more moments where the Duke's newfound understanding would undoubtedly be tested against old habits and older fears. But standing together in the quiet evening light, hands finally, openly joined, neither Rosalind nor Gideon doubted, even for a moment, that whatever difficulties lay ahead, they would be worth facing together. Winter softened slowly into spring, and with it, the sharp edges of scandal that had once threatened to define the Winslow family began, gradually, to fade into something quieter, something closer to acceptance. It did not happen all at once, nor without difficulty, but piece by piece. The household that had once been governed almost entirely by fear and careful control began to transform into something warmer, something built on honesty rather than mere obedience. Lily and Owen were married in a small, quiet ceremony at the same village chapel where Seraphina had married Julian, though the guest list was considerably shorter, and the gowns considerably simpler. Several of the county's more particular families declined their invitations, unwilling to associate themselves publicly with a match so far beneath what they considered proper. But those who did attend witnessed something the grander wedding had not quite managed to capture: a marriage built entirely on genuine affection, without a single calculation of land or title clouding the vows exchanged between them. The Duke walked his middle daughter down the aisle himself, and though his expression remained carefully composed throughout the ceremony, Rosalind, watching from her seat beside Seraphina, noticed the way his hand trembled slightly as he placed Lily's own hand into Owen's, the way his eyes glistened briefly before he mastered himself once more. It was not the wedding he had once imagined for any of his daughters, grand and strategically advantageous, but watching Lily's face as she said her vows, radiant with a happiness that had nothing to do with wealth or status, he seemed, for the first time, genuinely at peace with the choice. Seraphina, too, had softened considerably in the months since the confrontation in the hallway, her initial concern for reputation gradually giving way to genuine happiness for her sister, particularly once it became clear that Julian himself held no objection whatsoever to the match, finding in Owen a quiet, steady kindness he genuinely admired. "I was wrong," Seraphina admitted to Rosalind quietly during the wedding breakfast, watching Lily laugh freely across the room in a way she rarely had before. "I was so afraid of what the world might say that I nearly convinced myself it mattered more than her happiness. Thank you for refusing to let either of us forget what truly matters." "You were only trying to protect her in the way you knew how," Rosalind said gently. "We have all been learning this past year that protection and control are not always the same thing." Seraphina studied her sister for a long moment, something thoughtful crossing her expression. "And you and Mr. Marsh? How does father truly feel about that particular development?" Rosalind glanced across the room, where Gideon stood in quiet conversation with the Duke near the refreshment table, an image that would have seemed utterly impossible only months earlier. Their conversation appeared, remarkably, almost easy, occasional laughter passing between them that had certainly never existed during Gideon's early days managing the estate's ledgers. "He is still adjusting," Rosalind admitted, "but he has stopped fighting it, which, for our father, represents considerable progress." It had not been an easy transition, in truth. The Duke had insisted on a proper courtship, formal and carefully observed, despite the fact that Rosalind and Gideon had already, in their own private ways, moved well past the careful boundaries such courtships typically required. There had been difficult conversations about Gideon's position within the household, about how society would perceive a duke's daughter marrying so far beneath her established station, about whether Gideon would continue managing the estate, or whether some other arrangement might prove more suitable once they were properly wed. But slowly, steadily, the Duke had come to see in Gideon exactly what Rosalind had seen from the very beginning: a man of genuine integrity, patient where her father was often rigid, calm where the rest of the household frequently descended into chaos, and utterly, completely devoted to her happiness in a way no calculated arrangement could ever have manufactured. "He asked me something rather significant last week," the Duke admitted to Rosalind privately, several weeks after Lily's wedding, finding her alone in the garden where she so often retreated when she needed quiet space to think. Gideon, that is. Rosalind's heart quickened. And what did you tell him? I told him, the Duke said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through his usual careful composure, that any man brave enough to fall in love with you, fully aware of exactly what that would entail, deserved considerably more credit than most men twice his social standing. He paused, studying his daughter carefully. I also told him that if he ever caused you a single moment of true unhappiness, he would answer directly to me, Duke or no Duke standing between us. Rosalind laughed, warm and genuine, throwing her arms around her father in a way that would once have felt entirely foreign between them, but now felt as natural as breathing. Thank you, she whispered, for finally seeing me. All of me, not simply the parts that were easiest to manage. I should have seen it years ago, the Duke admitted quietly, holding his daughter close. Your mother always said you had her spirit, wild and unstoppable in exactly the way she once was, before duty and expectation slowly wore her down into someone quieter. I spent 5 years terrified that same fate awaited you, and in trying to prevent it, very nearly caused it myself. He pulled back slightly, studying her face with genuine tenderness. I am glad, more than I can properly express, that you never once allowed me to succeed. The wedding between Rosalind and Gideon took place the following autumn, beneath the very orchard trees where their careful, quiet courtship had first begun. It was not a grand affair by the standards Winslow Hall had once been known for, but it was filled with genuine warmth, laughter carrying freely through the golden afternoon air, and every single person in attendance, family and friend alike, understood exactly what they were witnessing. A marriage built entirely on choice rather than obligation, on partnership rather than control. The Duke walked his youngest daughter down the aisle himself, and when he placed her hand into Gideon's, there was no trembling hesitation this time, no carefully guarded grief hiding behind composed formality. There was simply pride, open and unguarded, the expression of a father who had finally, truly learned to see his daughter exactly as she was, rather than the shape he had once tried desperately to force her into becoming. As the ceremony concluded, and the guests began the celebration that would carry long into the evening, Rosalind found a quiet moment alone with her father near the edge of the orchard, away from the noise and laughter of the gathered crowd. "Are you happy?" he asked her simply, watching Gideon across the garden, already deep in easy conversation with several of the household staff who had grown genuinely fond of him over the past year. "Happier than I ever believed possible," Rosalind said honestly. "And you, father? Are you at peace with how things have unfolded, even though none of it happened the way you originally planned?" The Duke considered the question carefully, watching his 3 daughters scattered across the garden, Serafina laughing beside Julian, Lily resting her head contentedly against Owen's shoulder, Rosalind standing beside him now, radiant in a way he had not seen since before his wife's death had cast its long shadow over the entire household. "I am," he finally said, and meant it completely. "I spent 5 years believing that love and structure could not coexist, that protecting my daughters meant controlling every choice available to them. I was wrong, Rosalind, about nearly everything, except perhaps this." He turned to look at her, something warm and unmistakably proud in his expression. "You were never the daughter who ruined my sanity, though I confess I believed that myself, more than once, during our more difficult years together. You were simply the daughter brave enough to insist that this family finally learn how to live honestly, rather than merely surviving behind careful, respectable walls. For that, I owe you more gratitude than I will ever properly manage to express." Rosalind smiled, leaning her head briefly against her father's shoulder, watching the golden evening light settle gently over the orchard, over Gideon laughing easily among people who had once viewed him merely as hired help, over her sisters finally living lives built on genuine happiness rather than careful arrangement. "We ruined each other's certainty, father," she said softly. "But I think, in the end, that was exactly what this family needed." Behind them, the celebration continued long into the night, laughter and music carrying across the quiet grounds of Winslow Hall. A house that had once been governed almost entirely by grief and rigid control. Now finally, fully alive again, exactly as it had been before tragedy first cast its shadow. And perhaps, in certain quiet, unexpected ways, even more alive than that. 2 years passed, and Winslow Hall settled into a rhythm none of its residents could have predicted during the difficult years that came before. Rosalind and Gideon had taken up residence in a smaller manor house on the edge of the estate, close enough that she visited her father nearly every week, far enough that she and Gideon had built something entirely their own, a household run on partnership rather than hierarchy, where decisions were discussed openly rather than dictated from above. It was during the early days of a particularly harsh winter that a new test arrived, one none of them had anticipated. A fever moved quietly through the county, striking several households along the river road before finally reaching the outer edges of Winslow land. The Duke, now noticeably grayer at the temples but softer in temperament than he had been in years, insisted on visiting the affected tenant families himself, determined to ensure proper care reached every corner of his land, rather than simply issuing instructions from the safety of his study. Rosalind, hearing of her father's plans, rode to Winslow Hall immediately, finding him already preparing his horse despite Mrs. Pratt's obvious disapproval hovering nearby. "You should not go alone," Rosalind said, dismounting quickly. "Not with the roads as treacherous as they are, and certainly not with a fever spreading through the very houses you intend to visit. I built this estate on the backs of these families, Rosalind. I will not hide behind these walls while they suffer." "Then I am coming with you." The Duke opened his mouth to argue, old habits rising briefly to the surface, before catching himself, something almost amused flickering across his tired face. "You always were going to say that, regardless of what I told you. You are only now realizing this, after everything we have been through together." He laughed, genuine and warm, and together they rode out toward the tenant cottages, distributing medicine and supplies that Gideon, upon hearing of the outbreak, had already arranged to have sent from the nearest town. It was grueling, difficult work, made harder by the bitter cold and the fear evident on every face they encountered, but father and daughter worked side by side through it all, and by the time the worst of the fever finally passed nearly 3 weeks later, something had shifted permanently between them, a partnership forged not through comfortable celebration, but through shared hardship faced honestly together. It was during this same difficult winter that Lily arrived at Rosalind's door one gray afternoon, her face pale but her eyes bright with news she could barely contain. "I am expecting," she said, before Rosalind had even fully opened the door. "Owen and we are going to have a child." Rosalind pulled her sister into an immediate, delighted embrace, joy chasing away the exhaustion of the past difficult weeks. "Does father know?" "Not yet. I wanted to tell you first." Lily's smile wavered slightly. "I confess I am nervous to tell him. I know how much he wanted grand things for all of us once, and I worry, even now, that a printer's child will never quite measure up to whatever he originally imagined for his grandchildren." "Lily," Rosalind took her sister's hands firmly, "father has changed more than either of us could have predicted 2 years ago. Trust him. Trust yourself. Whatever fears you are carrying, I promise you they are smaller than you believe." Lily's fears, as it turned out, were entirely unfounded. When she finally shared the news with the Duke the following week, his reaction was immediate and unrestrained, joy breaking across his face without a single trace of the careful reservation that had once defined nearly every interaction within the family. "A grandchild," he said, his voice thick with emotion, pulling Lily into a tight embrace. "Your mother would have been so very happy, Lily. She always said this house needed more laughter in it, more life. I am only sorry it has taken me this long to understand what she truly meant by that." The child, a healthy girl born the following summer, was named Miriam, after the grandmother she would never meet but whose spirit, everyone in the family agreed, seemed to live on quite clearly in every one of her granddaughters. The Duke doted on the infant with an openness that surprised even Seraphina, who had by then, welcomed a son of her own, and watched with quiet wonder as her once rigid, controlled father transformed into a grandfather who laughed easily, who told stories long into the evening, who seemed determined to give his grandchildren exactly the warmth and freedom he had once, in his grief, withheld from his own daughters. Rosalind and Gideon, meanwhile, continued building their own quiet life together, managing the smaller estate with the same careful partnership that had first drawn them together in the stable yard years earlier. Gideon eventually stepped back from managing Winslow Hall directly, training a capable young steward to take his place, though he remained a close and trusted advisor to the Duke whenever difficult decisions arose. Rosalind, for her part, found herself increasingly drawn toward the tenant families scattered across the estate, establishing a small school for the village children, funded partly by her own household and partly by a surprising, generous contribution from her father, who seemed to take genuine pride in watching his once unruly daughter channel her restless energy into something that benefited the entire community. It was at the opening of that very school, on a bright spring morning nearly 3 years after Serafina's wedding first set this long, complicated story into motion, that the entire family gathered together, truly together, for what felt like the first time in longer than any of them could properly remember. The Duke stood at the edge of the small crowd gathered outside the newly built schoolhouse, watching his 3 daughters move easily among the village families, Serafina with her son balanced on her hip, deep in conversation with several tenant mothers about the curriculum, Lily laughing freely with baby Miriam wrapped snugly against the spring chill, Rosalind standing at the schoolhouse door, welcoming the first group of children inside with genuine warmth radiating from every part of her expression. "You did this," Gideon said quietly, coming to stand beside the Duke, both men watching the scene unfold before them. "All of it. Whatever doubts you carried these past years, whatever mistakes you believe you made along the way, look at what your family has become." "I did very little of it myself," the Duke admitted honestly. "I merely eventually stopped standing in the way." "Sometimes," Gideon said, "that is precisely what love requires, not control, simply enough trust to step aside and allow the people we care for to become exactly who they were always meant to be." The Duke nodded slowly, watching Rosalind laugh with one of the village children who had asked her an obviously mischievous question, her spirit as bright and unstoppable as it had ever been, though gentler now, tempered by years of hard-won understanding rather than diminished by them. "She used to terrify me," he admitted, a small, genuine smile touching his weathered face. That fire in her, that absolute refusal to bend to anything she did not believe in her heart to be right, I spent years believing it would be the ruin of this family. "And now," the Duke said, watching his youngest daughter with unmistakable pride, "I understand it was never ruin she was bringing to this family at all. It was life. Real, honest, unguarded life, the very thing I very nearly forgot how to allow myself, after your predecessor's death took so much of it from me." As the afternoon stretched golden and warm across the village green, the Winslow family gathered together beneath the newly raised schoolhouse sign, 3 sisters who had once been carefully measured against one another, now standing together as equals, bound not by obligation or careful arrangement, but by genuine, hard-won love. The Duke watched them all, his daughters, their husbands, their children, the community they had helped build together, and felt, for the first time in longer than grief had allowed him to properly measure, something that felt remarkably, unmistakably like peace. The story of the Duke, his 3 daughters, and the unruly one who had once seemed determined to ruin every careful plan he ever made, had not ended the way he originally intended it to, not remotely. But standing there in the warm spring sunlight, surrounded by the family his youngest daughter's stubborn, unbending courage had ultimately helped save, Duke Alaric Winslow understood, completely and without a single trace of doubt, that it had ended exactly the way it always should have, and that the daughter who had once seemed so determined to unravel his careful world had, in the end, simply been showing him how to build something far better in its place.